Sometimes the smallest decision you make for a stranger becomes the biggest turning point in your own life. Cold rain swept across the back roads outside Pittsburgh, turning the cracked pavement into a mirror of blurred headlights and endless gray clouds. Naomi Carter tightened her hands around the steering wheel of her aging pickup truck as she drove home after a 12-hour shift with Allegheny County Emergency Medical Services. Exhaustion weighed heavily on her shoulders, but years of responding to emergencies had taught her that tired eyes could never replace alert instincts. A flooded section of the interstate had forced traffic onto unfamiliar county roads, leading her through an abandoned industrial district where silent warehouses and unfinished buildings stood beneath the storm like forgotten monuments. Lightning briefly illuminated the skeletal frame of a construction project that had clearly been deserted for months. Rust-covered sections of exposed steel, construction fencing leaned unevenly in the wind, and puddles reflected the lonely glow of a single maintenance light flickering near the entrance. Naomi drove past the site without giving it much thought until she heard something that made her instinctively lift her foot from the accelerator. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was almost swallowed by the rain, faint enough to disappear beneath the rhythm of water striking her windshield. She turned off the radio and listened again. Several seconds passed before the same deliberate knocking echoed through the darkness. It was not random. It was steady. It sounded like someone trying to be heard. Naomi pulled safely onto the muddy shoulder and remained inside the truck for a moment, carefully scanning the empty construction site through the rain. There were no workers, no moving vehicles, and no visible lights except the weak maintenance lamp near the unfinished structure. Common sense suggested that she should continue driving and report what she had heard later. Experience suggested something entirely different. She stepped outside, pulling her navy rain jacket tightly around herself as cold rain immediately soaked her boots. Carrying a powerful flashlight from her emergency equipment bag, she followed the direction of the sound through scattered construction materials and muddy pathways. Every few steps she stopped to listen. The knocking returned, louder than before, guiding her deeper into the abandoned project. Finally, she reached what appeared to be a partially buried maintenance access, hidden beneath broken wooden boards and layers of wet dirt. She knelt beside the rusted metal hatch and brushed away enough debris to expose its edge. Before she could touch it, 3 slow knocks answered from somewhere beneath the ground. Naomi leaned closer. "If someone is down there, keep knocking," she called. 3 more deliberate taps echoed back through the confined space. Her pulse quickened. She immediately reached for her phone to request technical rescue support, but the screen displayed a frustrating message. No service. She climbed onto a nearby concrete platform, hoping to find a signal, but every attempt failed. The nearest occupied roadway was several miles away, and precious minutes could matter if someone below was trapped without help. Naomi took a slow breath and looked around the abandoned equipment yard. A heavy steel pry bar rested beside an old toolbox that workers had apparently left behind months earlier. She carried it to the maintenance hatch and carefully worked the rusted edge until the metal cover finally shifted with a deep groan. Fresh air rushed into the narrow opening. Naomi lowered her flashlight into the darkness below. The beam revealed rough concrete walls, exposed utility pipes, and finally a man sitting against the far wall with dust covering his tailored navy overcoat. He slowly lifted his head toward the light, revealing tired blue eyes filled with disbelief and quiet hope. Even beneath the dirt and exhaustion, Naomi immediately recognized the face from countless business magazines displayed in grocery store checkout lines. Ethan Sterling, the billionaire chief executive officer whose company had transformed skylines across America, was looking back at the ordinary paramedic who had simply decided to stop when everyone else had driven past. Naomi immediately switched from surprise to professional focus, setting aside every headline she had ever seen about Ethan Sterling. At that moment, he was not one of the most recognizable business leaders in America. He was simply a man who needed help. She lowered herself carefully through the maintenance opening until her boots reached the concrete floor below. The narrow utility corridor smelled of damp concrete and fresh rain drifting in through the open hatch above. Ethan attempted to stand but quickly steadied himself against the wall. Naomi raised a reassuring hand. "Please stay where you are for a minute. I am a paramedic, and I want to make sure you are all right before we move." Ethan nodded with visible relief. His voice remained calm, although exhaustion was written across his face. "I thought no one could hear me anymore." Naomi knelt beside him, checking his breathing, his pulse, and asking a series of routine questions that she had repeated thousands of times during her career. He answered clearly and remained fully alert. Aside from fatigue, dehydration, and stiffness from spending hours in the confined space, he appeared remarkably fortunate. Naomi handed him a bottle of water from her emergency kit and encouraged him to drink slowly. As the color gradually returned to his face, Ethan looked around the underground corridor before meeting her eyes again. "I owe you my life," he said quietly. Naomi smiled with the calm confidence that had reassured countless patients over the years. "You do not owe me anything. I just happened to hear something that did not sound right." Together they examined the safest path back toward the opening. The old access ladder remained secure despite its age, and Naomi climbed first to make certain it could support their weight. She then guided Ethan upward one careful step at a time until both finally emerged into the cool evening rain. Fresh air filled their lungs as thunder rolled farther away across the hills. For several long moments neither of them spoke. The silence itself felt like proof that ordinary things could suddenly become extraordinary. In the distance, the sound of approaching vehicles finally broke the quiet. Black sport utility vehicles entered the construction site, followed by local emergency responders who had apparently received Ethan's delayed distress signal after communication systems reconnected. Several members of his security team hurried toward him with expressions of overwhelming relief, but Ethan immediately turned back toward Naomi before anyone else could speak. One of his assistants opened a leather briefcase and quietly offered an envelope. Ethan accepted it before stepping closer. "Please," he said sincerely, "allow me to thank you in some small way." Naomi looked at the envelope only briefly before gently shaking her head. "I appreciate your kindness, but I cannot accept it." Ethan seemed genuinely surprised. Throughout his career, financial gratitude had solved almost every difficult situation. This time it did not. Naomi zipped her medical bag, adjusted the strap across her shoulder, and prepared to leave. Ethan called after her once more. "Then tell me what I can do." She paused beside her truck and looked back through the gentle rain. "If life gives you another chance, spend it making someone else's life better. That is worth more than anything you could hand me tonight." Her words lingered in the quiet air long after she climbed into the driver's seat. Ethan remained standing beside the construction entrance, watching the old pickup disappear down the wet county road until its taillights faded into the darkness. Around him, security officers discussed procedures, investigators examined the maintenance entrance, and emergency crews secured the area. Yet none of those conversations held his attention. For the first time in many years, the billionaire who had built an empire through strategy and ambition found himself thinking not about profits, acquisitions, or board meetings, but about a woman whose greatest wealth was the compassion to stop on a lonely road because she believed that even the faintest cry for help deserved to be answered. 3 days passed, yet the memory of that rainy night refused to leave Ethan Sterling's mind. His schedule had returned to its familiar rhythm of executive meetings, financial reports, and strategic planning sessions inside Sterling Global Headquarters. But something had quietly shifted. Every decision suddenly seemed smaller than the simple choice one stranger had made to stop her truck because she believed someone might need help. The words Naomi had spoken echoed through his thoughts more often than he expected. "If life gives you another chance, spend it making someone else's life better." It was a sentence with no complicated language, no business strategy, and no hidden agenda, yet it challenged him more deeply than any presentation he had heard in years. Rather than asking his staff to arrange another formal gesture of appreciation, Ethan decided to find Naomi himself. After confirming only her public work location through official emergency service contacts, he drove without media attention to the Allegheny County Emergency Medical Services Station on the edge of Pittsburgh. The building was modest compared to the glass towers that carried his company name, but it radiated a different kind of purpose. Ambulances stood neatly prepared for the next emergency. Paramedics inspected equipment with practiced precision while dispatch radios quietly filled the air with routine updates. Ethan remained near the entrance, observing without interrupting the organized flow of people whose work depended not on quarterly results but on every passing minute. Across the vehicle bay, he finally saw Naomi. She was patiently helping a newly hired paramedic organize medical supplies inside an ambulance, explaining the importance of checking every piece of equipment before each shift. Her movements were calm and efficient, never rushed despite the demanding environment around her. When the younger employee accidentally placed several items in the wrong compartment, Naomi simply smiled, corrected the mistake, and explained the system again without a trace of frustration. Ethan watched silently, realizing that the same quiet confidence she had shown beneath the abandoned construction site was simply part of who she was every single day. She noticed him only after finishing the equipment inspection. A brief expression of surprise crossed her face before she walked toward him with the same professional smile. "Mr. Sterling," she said warmly, "you look much better than the last time I saw you." Ethan laughed softly. "Thanks to you, I certainly feel better." He handed her a small white envelope. Naomi looked at it for a moment before raising one eyebrow with gentle amusement. "I already told you that I cannot accept money." Ethan shook his head. "It is not money." She opened the envelope carefully and found a handwritten letter instead. The message contained nothing more than a sincere thank you for reminding him that leadership began with humanity instead of success. Folded beside the letter was a gift card from a neighborhood coffee shop located only a few blocks away. Naomi smiled, relieved that this gesture carried thoughtfulness instead of obligation. "Coffee is something I can accept," she said with a quiet laugh. A few minutes later, they walked together to the small family-owned cafe where paramedics often stopped between emergency calls. No private dining room had been reserved. No security perimeter had been created. They simply sat near the front window with 2 cups of fresh coffee, while people outside continued living ordinary lives. Ethan listened as Naomi spoke about serving neighborhoods where every family deserved respect regardless of income or background. She never spoke about heroism. She simply described her work as showing up when people needed someone to stay calm. Before leaving, Ethan hesitated for a moment before asking one final question. "Would you be willing to return to that construction site with me? There are still questions I cannot stop thinking about." Naomi looked thoughtfully through the cafe window before meeting his eyes again. "I have been thinking about that night too," she admitted. "Some things there never quite made sense." Ethan nodded. For the first time since climbing out of the underground maintenance corridor, both of them realized that their story had not ended with a rescue. It had only just begun. The following Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and cool spring air as Naomi parked her pickup truck outside the fenced construction site where everything had begun. The heavy rain had disappeared, revealing details that had been hidden beneath darkness only days before. Ethan was already waiting near the entrance wearing a simple navy jacket instead of his usual formal business suit, accompanied only by one security officer who respectfully remained several yards away to give them privacy. The abandoned project looked strangely peaceful beneath the bright sunlight. Steel beams stretched toward the blue sky, unfinished concrete walls cast long shadows across the empty ground, and faded warning signs moved gently in the breeze. Naomi studied the area carefully before speaking. "Everything feels different during the day, but something still does not fit." Ethan nodded. "I have replayed that night in my head dozens of times. The official report says I accidentally became trapped after inspecting the property alone. But the more I think about it, the less sense that explanation makes." They walked slowly toward the maintenance entrance where Naomi had first heard the faint knocking beneath the rain. The rusted hatch now stood secured by investigators, but the surrounding area remained largely untouched. Naomi looked beyond the obvious evidence and instead focused on ordinary details that most people would ignore. Years of emergency response had taught her that small observations often revealed the larger story. Near the edge of a concrete barrier, she noticed something bright beneath a layer of dried leaves. She bent down and carefully lifted an orange construction safety helmet that appeared surprisingly clean compared to everything surrounding it. The plastic surface showed only a few drops of dried mud despite having supposedly remained outside through days of heavy rain. Ethan accepted the helmet and turned it over in his hands. Attached inside was a manufacturer identification label with a printed serial number that remained perfectly readable. "This should have been assigned to one of the site supervisors," he said thoughtfully. "Every piece of safety equipment on our projects is registered." Naomi gently ran her fingers across the smooth surface. "Then why does it look newer than the equipment stored inside the buildings?" Ethan looked around the silent construction site without answering immediately. Instead, he photographed the serial number using his phone before making a note to verify it with company records. As they continued walking, Naomi noticed tire marks preserved in a section of hardened mud, leading toward a temporary service road that had supposedly been closed for several weeks. She crouched for a closer look before quietly saying, "Someone has been here more recently than people realize." Ethan followed her gaze, surprised that he had completely overlooked the tracks. Before either of them could continue discussing their observations, Ethan's phone began ringing. The caller identification displayed the name Victor Lang, Sterling Global's longtime chief operations officer and one of Ethan's most trusted executives. Ethan answered with his usual calm professionalism. Victor's voice immediately expressed concern and relief, asking how Ethan had been recovering and whether he intended to reopen questions about the abandoned construction project. Ethan replied that he was simply reviewing the site personally before making any decisions. There was a brief pause on the other end of the call before Victor suggested that there was probably nothing more to discover and recommended allowing the insurance process to continue without unnecessary complications. Ethan ended the conversation politely, but something about the timing felt unusually convenient. Naomi noticed the thoughtful expression on his face. "Everything all right?" she asked. Ethan slipped his phone into his jacket pocket while looking once more at the orange helmet resting in his hands. "Maybe," he answered slowly, "or maybe someone is hoping we stop asking questions before we understand what really happened here." Naomi looked across the quiet construction site where sunlight now revealed every corner that darkness had once concealed. The place no longer felt abandoned. It felt as though it had been waiting patiently for someone willing to notice the details everyone else had chosen to overlook. The drive back to Sterling Global headquarters was unusually quiet. Ethan kept the orange construction helmet on the passenger seat beside him instead of placing it in the trunk, as though seeing it reminded him that unanswered questions deserved real attention. By Monday morning, he instructed his executive office to begin a routine internal review of the abandoned construction project, presenting it simply as a standard operational assessment rather than an emergency investigation. He wanted facts before assumptions. Inside the company's glass headquarters overlooking downtown Pittsburgh, departments responded quickly to the request. Digital files, equipment inventories, contractor reports, and inspection records gradually appeared on secure conference room screens. At first, everything seemed perfectly organized, exactly as one of the country's most respected corporations would expect. Yet the more Ethan examined the records, the more small inconsistencies began to surface. The serial number from the orange helmet did not match the equipment assignment listed in the database. According to the official inventory, that helmet had supposedly been transferred to another active construction site nearly 200 miles away almost 2 months earlier. Ethan frowned as he reviewed the timeline again. The numbers did not agree with the object resting on the conference table in front of him. Rather than drawing conclusions, he quietly requested additional verification from the corporate compliance department. Meanwhile, Naomi returned to her normal ambulance shifts, but she found herself replaying the details of the construction site whenever she had a quiet moment between emergency calls. One afternoon, while cleaning medical equipment after transporting a patient, she remembered the unusual condition of the helmet. Everything surrounding the maintenance entrance had shown signs of weeks of exposure to rain and dust, yet that single piece of safety equipment had appeared almost untouched. The contrast continued to bother her. Later that evening, Ethan called to update her on the internal review. He explained the inventory discrepancy without exaggeration, carefully separating confirmed facts from unanswered questions. Naomi listened thoughtfully before responding. Sometimes people focus so much on what is missing that they overlook what should not be there in the first place. Ethan paused. "What do you mean?" "The helmet looked too clean for its surroundings," she replied. "If the records say it belongs somewhere else, Maybe it arrived there much later than everyone assumes. Her observation immediately gave Ethan a different perspective. The issue was no longer simply where the helmet belonged, but when it had actually appeared at the abandoned site. The following morning, he expanded the review to include equipment transfer logs, security access records, and maintenance schedules covering the previous several months. Members of the compliance team began quietly comparing archived information from different departments. During the process, one analyst discovered that several digital entries connected to the construction project had been modified after the site officially closed. The edits themselves appeared routine, but the timestamps suggested they had all been completed within the same brief period using executive-level authorization. Ethan requested the original audit history. A few minutes later, the analyst returned with an uncomfortable expression. Someone removed portions of the change history before the archive was finalized, she explained carefully. The documents are still here, but part of the record trail is incomplete. Ethan remained calm, thanking the team for their professionalism before dismissing the meeting for the afternoon. Alone in the conference room, he looked through the glass walls toward the city skyline that his company had helped shape over decades. Sterling Global had built its reputation on accountability and public trust. If someone inside the organization had quietly altered official records, protecting that reputation now required transparency rather than silence. He picked up the orange helmet once more, studying its worn safety label under the afternoon sunlight. A simple object that most people would have ignored had quietly become the first thread leading toward a much larger truth, hidden somewhere inside the very company he had spent his life building. By the end of the week, the internal review had quietly expanded beyond a routine audit. Ethan insisted that every step remain confidential, not because he wanted to hide the truth, but because he wanted the truth to be protected until every fact could be verified. Rumors spread easily inside large corporations, and he refused to allow speculation to replace evidence. The compliance team continued comparing archived records with security system logs while information technology specialists attempted to recover portions of the missing digital history. Late Friday afternoon, Ethan returned to his office after a meeting with outside legal advisors and found a plain white envelope resting neatly in the center of his desk. There was no name on the front, no company logo, and no indication of who had delivered it. Inside was a single sheet of paper containing only one sentence printed in simple black letters. Some foundations are stronger when no one digs beneath them. Ethan read the message twice before placing it inside his desk drawer. He did not react with fear. Instead, the anonymous warning confirmed something he had already begun to suspect. Someone was paying close attention to the investigation. Rather than slowing the review, the note strengthened his determination to continue. That evening he called Naomi while she was finishing paperwork after another ambulance shift. She listened quietly as Ethan described the anonymous message. After a brief silence, she asked, "Did it tell you to stop?" "Not directly," Ethan answered. "Then whoever wrote it expected you to understand the message without explaining it. That tells me they are worried about what you might discover." Ethan smiled slightly. "You always seem to notice the part everyone else misses." Naomi laughed softly. "That is what paramedics do. We pay attention to details because details often explain the whole situation." The following Monday, Ethan authorized an independent forensic audit performed by an outside consulting firm that had never worked with Sterling Global before. He wanted experienced professionals who would examine every record without personal relationships or internal assumptions influencing their conclusions. Some senior executives questioned the decision, arguing that the company's own departments were fully capable of handling the review. Ethan respectfully thanked them for their opinions, but explained that public trust required complete transparency. Accountability meant inviting independent verification even when it felt uncomfortable. While the external auditors began collecting electronic records, Naomi continued focusing on her patients, yet she occasionally received brief updates from Ethan. One afternoon, she joined him for coffee near the headquarters after finishing an early shift. They sat outside beneath clear spring skies watching people hurry through the downtown streets. Ethan admitted that he had spent most of his career believing leadership meant always having answers. Now I realize leadership sometimes means asking difficult questions and being willing to hear whatever the answers may be, he said thoughtfully. Naomi nodded. People trust leaders who are willing to learn, especially when learning is not easy. Their conversation ended as Ethan received a call from the lead forensic auditor. Initial analysis had uncovered several executive access credentials used to modify archived project files during unusual hours over multiple weekends. The activity did not prove wrongdoing, but it clearly justified a deeper examination. Ethan thanked the auditor and immediately scheduled a special meeting of the board of directors for the following week. Every member would receive the preliminary findings directly from the independent investigators rather than through internal summaries. As he looked across the city skyline from his office later that evening, the lights reflecting against the glass towers seemed different than they had only days before. Buildings could be constructed from steel, glass, and concrete, but organizations were built upon something far less visible. Trust. Once questioned, it could only be restored through honesty. Somewhere within thousands of digital records, security logs, and archived files, the complete story still waited to be uncovered, and Ethan knew that the next board meeting would become one of the most important moments in the history of Sterling Global. The board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday, giving the independent forensic team only a few more days to complete its preliminary review. Every hour seemed to uncover another small detail that connected pieces of a much larger puzzle. Rather than searching for dramatic discoveries, the investigators focused on ordinary records that most people overlooked. Backup servers, archived email logs, equipment transfers, security credentials, and parking gate activity all became part of a careful timeline. Early Wednesday morning, the lead forensic auditor called Ethan with unexpected news. During a routine recovery of archived server data, technicians had located an older backup that had not been included in the company's primary document management system. It contained copies of system activity recorded before portions of the official audit history had been modified. Ethan immediately joined the investigators in the secure review room. Large monitors displayed thousands of digital records while specialists patiently compared timestamps across multiple databases. One sequence immediately drew their attention. The same executive-level credentials that had modified project files also appeared in access records connected to the abandoned construction site during the week before Ethan became trapped underground. The credentials had been used outside normal business hours, and the activity continued over several consecutive evenings. The discovery alone did not establish intent, but it demonstrated that the official timeline presented after the incident had been incomplete. The investigators continued verifying every detail before reaching any conclusion. Later that afternoon, another analyst reviewed archived parking gate records stored separately from the building security system. The information revealed that a company vehicle assigned to the executive office had entered the construction site during one of the same evenings, reflected in the recovered digital logs. Again, the record did not prove wrongdoing, but it independently confirmed that executive-level activity had occurred at the location after the project had supposedly been inactive. Ethan appreciated the investigators' discipline. Nobody rushed toward accusations. Every conclusion required support from multiple independent sources. Meanwhile, Naomi completed another ambulance shift before meeting Ethan at the headquarters conference center. Although she was not part of the corporate investigation, Ethan valued the perspective she consistently brought to every conversation. He carefully explained the recovered records and the importance of verifying every piece of information before presenting it to the board. Naomi listened thoughtfully while studying the printed timeline spread across the conference table. After several quiet moments, she pointed toward one section where equipment transfers, digital modifications, and vehicle entries appeared unusually close together. When unrelated events happen at nearly the same time, sometimes they are not unrelated at all, she said. You do not have to guess why. You simply have to understand how they connect. Ethan looked at the timeline again and realized she had noticed something none of the analysts had mentioned. The sequence itself suggested coordination rather than coincidence. The lead forensic auditor agreed that the pattern deserved additional examination before the board meeting. Throughout the evening, investigators continued cross-checking archived contractor schedules, maintenance requests, and visitor logs until every recovered record aligned consistently with the developing timeline. Shortly before midnight, The lead auditor placed a neatly organized evidence binder on the conference table. It contained verified digital recovery reports, equipment inventory comparisons, executive access records, parking gate documentation, and independent authentication summaries prepared according to professional forensic standards. Nothing inside relied upon assumptions. Every page reflected information that could be independently confirmed. Ethan slowly closed the binder and looked through the conference room windows toward the lights of downtown Pittsburgh. Only one step remained. The following morning, the board of directors would receive the findings directly from the independent investigators. Whatever conclusions eventually followed would belong to the evidence itself rather than personal opinions, and for the first time since that rainy night beneath the abandoned construction site, Ethan felt confident that the truth no longer depended on memory alone because it was now supported by facts that had refused to disappear. Thursday morning arrived with clear skies above downtown Pittsburgh, but inside the executive boardroom the atmosphere was defined not by tension, but by quiet professionalism. Members of the board of directors gathered around the long walnut conference table, while representatives from the independent forensic consulting firm prepared their presentation. Ethan sat at the head of the table with calm composure, making it clear from the beginning that the purpose of the meeting was not to assign blame but to understand verified facts. Every participant received the same evidence binder that had been assembled through days of careful review. The lead investigator thanked the board for requesting an independent examination and explained that every conclusion presented that morning had been supported by multiple verified sources. Large presentation screens displayed a chronological timeline beginning with equipment inventory records, continuing through archived system backups, executive access credentials, parking gate activity, and recovered audit histories. Each document had been independently authenticated before inclusion in the report. As the presentation continued, the investigators demonstrated how several official records had been modified after the construction project had already been suspended. The recovered backup servers preserved earlier versions of those files, allowing the consulting team to compare every change with the final archived records. The orange construction helmet rested inside a transparent evidence bag on the conference table beside the investigators, no longer appearing to be an ordinary piece of safety equipment but instead the small detail that had first led to a much broader review. The lead investigator explained that the helmet's documented transfer history did not match its actual location, and independent verification confirmed that executive-level credentials had been used during multiple after-hours visits connected to the abandoned construction site. Although the report carefully avoided speculation regarding personal motives, it concluded that significant discrepancies existed between the official operational records and the independently verified timeline. When the presentation concluded, Ethan invited questions from every board member without limitation. The discussion remained respectful, thorough, and focused entirely on documented evidence. Victor Lang listened attentively throughout the meeting before acknowledging that additional clarification would be appropriate regarding several administrative decisions connected to the project. Rather than interrupting or disputing the investigators, he stated that he welcomed a complete external review so that every question could receive an objective answer. Ethan appreciated the professional tone that everyone maintained. Organizations built on integrity were strengthened by transparency rather than weakened by it. Before the board voted on the next steps, Ethan requested permission for one additional person to briefly address the meeting. Naomi entered the boardroom wearing her neatly pressed Navy paramedic uniform, looking composed despite the unfamiliar surroundings. She did not discuss corporate records or financial reports because those subjects belonged to the investigators. Instead, she simply described the evening she had discovered the maintenance hatch, the unusual condition of the construction site, and the reason she had returned days later after realizing that several ordinary details had not seemed consistent. Her testimony reminded everyone that the investigation had begun not with advanced technology but with careful observation and a willingness to ask honest questions. When she finished speaking, the room remained silent for several moments before the chair of the board thanked her for her professionalism and public service. Following a formal discussion, the directors unanimously approved a resolution authorizing continued cooperation with the independent forensic team, expanded governance reforms, and temporary administrative leave for any executive whose documented actions required additional external review until the process reached its conclusion. The decision was presented as a commitment to accountability rather than punishment. As the meeting adjourned, Ethan remained standing beside the conference table while morning sunlight reflected across the glass walls overlooking Pittsburgh. He realized that true leadership was never measured by the ability to avoid difficult moments. It was measured by the courage to face them with honesty, fairness, and respect for the truth. Even when the answers required changing the future of the company he had devoted his life to building. 6 months later, the place that had once represented unanswered questions became a symbol of hope for an entire community. The Carter Center for Emergency Response and Community Preparedness officially opened on a bright spring morning just outside downtown Pittsburgh, welcoming first responders, students, neighborhood leaders, and families from across the region. Built through a partnership between Sterling Global and local emergency service organizations, the center offered free disaster preparedness programs, first aid training, community safety workshops, and scholarships for future emergency medical professionals. Ethan stood near the entrance greeting guests, but those who had known him before the events of the previous year immediately noticed something different. The confidence that had always defined him remained, yet it was now accompanied by a quiet humility that could not be taught in any business school. Success was no longer measured only by the buildings his company constructed, but by the lives those investments could strengthen. Across the plaza, Naomi demonstrated basic emergency response techniques to a group of middle school students who listened with complete attention. She encouraged every child to remain calm during emergencies, reminding them that helping others often began with noticing the small things that everyone else overlooked. Watching her speak, Ethan realized that she had never tried to become an example for others. She had simply lived according to the values she believed every day, whether anyone was watching or not. Inside the main lobby, visitors paused before a simple glass display containing the orange construction helmet that had quietly changed so many lives. Beside it stood a small bronze plaque engraved with a single sentence. One act of kindness can become the foundation for countless second chances. People stopped to read the words before continuing through the building, many never realizing how deeply that message reflected the true history behind the center. Sterling Global had also completed a comprehensive governance reform program during the previous 6 months. Independent oversight procedures had been strengthened, executive accountability standards expanded, and transparent reporting practices introduced throughout every major project. Industry organizations praised the company not because it had avoided challenges, but because it had responded to difficult questions with honesty and meaningful improvement. Ethan often reminded new executives that protecting an organization's reputation did not begin with public relations. It began with telling the truth, especially when doing so required courage. As the afternoon celebration continued, Naomi and Ethan walked quietly through the landscaped courtyard where young trees had recently been planted. Children laughed nearby while volunteer firefighters demonstrated rescue equipment and paramedics invited families to explore modern ambulances. Everything around them reflected preparation, education, and hope rather than fear. Ethan smiled as he looked toward the center filled with people whose futures might be shaped by what they learned there. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I spent years believing I was building my greatest legacy with steel and glass." Naomi looked toward the students beginning another first aid class before answering. "Sometimes the strongest foundations are built with compassion instead." Ethan nodded. He understood those words more deeply than ever before. On a rainy night, a tired paramedic had chosen to stop because she believed a faint sound deserved to be heard. That single decision had not only given one man another chance at life, it had transformed an entire company, inspired a community, and created opportunities for countless strangers who would never know the full story. As the afternoon sun reflected across the glass walls of the new center, the future no longer seemed defined by power, wealth, or titles. It was defined by ordinary people making extraordinary choices when kindness called them to act, proving that the greatest measure of success would always be the difference one compassionate heart could make in the lives of others.